Hallelujah. Let Lord Jesus Christ shine forth. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us. Welcome to another live stream with DCCI Ministries. And tonight or this afternoon, wherever you are, we have the privilege of having Robert Spencer with us to talk about what does Islam teaches about Jewish people. Peace of Christ be with you, brother.
And with your spirit.
How are you doing, sir?
I am so well and so grateful and so happy to be here speaking with someone as illustrious as yourself.
Oh, did I do something bad?
No, that's all good.
Okay. Okay, because if I did something bad, you can privately first tell me off.
Oh no,
Um,
I actually am a great admirer of your courage and fearlessness in speaking the truth.
oh, thank you. Thank you. So tonight, I'm having you to kind of help us to think through what does Islam teaches about Jewish people. Main
Yes.
reason for that is um, recently, I think it was last year, we had this Mr. Muslim who traveled from miles, a couple of 100 miles away from north of England to London, someone called Ahmed Qureshi. And he attacked 5 Jews. And it ended up, after they figured out who he was, it ended up on the news now. Apparently, he's got mental illnesses. It just becomes like so common when Jew people is being attacked. He's got like mental attacker always have like mental health issues. And then also there are some Jewish people around the world who are kind of expressing how Islam and Muslims are nice to them. And I am looking at the Islamic sources. Sadly, I am not coming to the same conclusion with them. So I thought I'll have you and use some of your expertise that you can enlighten us. What does Islam teach us? And then we can start from the, according to tradition, from the founder of Islam, Muhammad. How did Muhammad engage with Jews? What does Quran talks? How does Quran talk about Jew people? If that's okay with you.
Certainly. In the first place, Ahmed Qureshi, they have to say he's mentally ill because they don't believe there's any jihad. The British authorities don't accept the existence of Islamic jihad, much less Islamic anti-Semitism. And so how can they explain that somebody would travel all that distance and attack Jewish people only? He clearly had to be insane. That's the only explanation that they have available to themselves after they have denied all the rest of it. But what they don't know and refuse to know is that the Quran is very deeply hateful toward Jews. Chapter 5, verse 82, it says they are the worst enemies of the Muslims. And hostility toward Jews and Judaism runs all the way through the Quran, the Hadith, the Sirat Rasulullah, the whole thing. So it's not in the least surprising that Ahmed Qureshi would attack Jews. What's surprising is that nobody in official Britain, nobody in the British government seems to know or care what his actual motivation was.
Well, I'm not
When
surprised on that.
Yes,
That's
well, you
something
would
I
you
expect these
very much
days.
so. So, when it comes to Judaism and Islam, it's a very strange history because we read in the Quran that Muhammad is the prophet or the messenger in the Quran is a prophet in the line of the prophets of the Jewish scriptures as well as the New Testament. And so there is Abraham, there's Moses, there's Jesus, and the others, of course, and then there's Muhammad. And the Quran even says in chapter 3, verse 67, Abraham was not a Jew or a Christian, Abraham was a Muslim. And many people say, how could Abraham be a Muslim if he lived so many years before Islam came to be a presence in the world? And the answer is that according to standard mainstream Islamic theology, Abraham, Moses, David, all the rest of them, John the Baptist and Jesus, they were all prophets of Islam, and they all taught Islam. And then the Jews and Christians, out of the evil in their hearts, changed the teachings of these prophets to create Judaism and Christianity. And so the teachings of the Bible about what these prophets and what Jesus taught is corrupted according to Islamic tradition, although that's not actually said in the Quran itself. But it's the only way they can make sense of what the Quran does say, because the Quran says that Abraham was a Muslim and that all these prophets were Muslim prophets, and that Christians should abide by what's written in the Gospels. And then they read the Gospels and it's nothing like what the Quran says. And so they say, oh, your gospel is corrupted.
Just a practical question. If the argument Muslims are bringing that Jewish scripture or Christian scripture is being corrupted, or both of them, what do you think, as it states in the Quran, that Muslims need to find Muhammad as prophesied prophet in the Torah and in the Injil, in the Gospels? How did, in 7th century, according to tradition, Jewish people and Muhammad kind of interpreted this?
Well, according to Islamic tradition, Muhammad came to the Jews and said he was their prophet, the new prophet. And the Jews looked through their scriptures and found that he was indeed their new prophet. This is according to Islamic tradition, 9th century Islamic tradition, that he was, I'm sorry, I just saw somebody say I was a lying Hindu agent. I'm Jewish, I'm Hindu, I'm everything. Anyway, no, I don't want to get off track here. Yeah, that's me. I
would expect them to say that Jews paid you, but now you are Hindu agent.
Yeah, well, they've been calling me Jewish for years because the Jews are the worst enemies of the Muslims. So they figure somebody who opposes Islam to the extent that I do must be Jewish. And also, people say that I look it, although I do not have the honor of being Jewish or Hindu. In any case, that's all irrelevant, and now I've lost where I was. We were talking about...
You were talking about how Jewish people tested Muhammad regarding his prophethood.
Yeah. He had a mole on his back in the shape of a fist, surrounded by warts. I can't imagine. But in any case, this was on his back. And according to, that's what Islamic tradition says. And according to the same Islamic traditions, this is in the Jews' scriptures, that the prophet will come with the mole in the shape of a fist, surrounded by warts. And so they knew that he was the prophet. And there are stories in Islamic tradition of the Jews, rabbis seeing Muhammad as a child and saying, oh, he's the prophet. And one of them says, yeah, he's going to bring a lot of trouble on our people because our people are going to reject him. And it would be the judgment of Allah upon them. And so the Jews, in other words, are depicted in Islamic tradition as knowing that Muhammad was the prophet, but refusing to accept it. And there was one righteous rabbi, according to the Hadith, where oh dear, there it is.
Yeah, I just I just wanted to put it there so that people can visualize what we are talking about in case like they don't know the topic we are discussing.
Okay. So anyway, yes, he Abdullah, the righteous rabbi, went to Muhammad and asked him, there are three questions that only a prophet knows the answer to. And so this is an impossible thing, because if this is the test, see, there are three questions that only a prophet knows the answer. And then Abdullah asks him the questions and he answers them. I have it right here. He says, what is the first portent of the hour? So that is the end of days. What is the first meal of the people of paradise? And what makes a baby look like its father or mother? And Muhammad says, Gabriel just told me the answers to these questions. Now wait a minute. This is so absurd. I'm sorry, but I don't understand why anybody ever took this seriously, ever. And I don't understand why people take this seriously now. Because if Abdullah knew the right answers, then Abdullah is a prophet, because only prophets know the answers to these questions. And if Abdullah is not a prophet and doesn't know the answers to these questions, then he can't know whether Muhammad's answers were right or not. And so either way, it's a completely useless story. But nonetheless, it's told straight. Abdullah asks him the three questions, and Muhammad answers. The first sign of the hour will be a fire that collects the people from east to west. The first meal of the people of paradise will be the caudite, or the extra lobe of the fish liver. And anyway, and then there's the third one about why the child will look like the father or the mother. It's all absurd. It's all pre-scientific. It's all superstitious. And above all, it's impossible. But on that basis, Abdullah says, you got the answers right, and becomes a Muslim. And then he says, you have to help me to show up these Jews because they're always lying. And so he tells Muhammad to call in the rabbis and ask them, what do you think of Abdullah? And so he calls in the rabbis, and he says, what do you think of Abdullah? And they say, oh, he's one of our best men. He's very wise. He's very smart. We love him. And then Abdullah comes out and says, La ilaha illallah, there's no God but Allah, Muhammad is his prophet. And then they say, oh, Abdullah is the worst man among us, and he's a terrible liar. But see, these absurd stories are presented in all seriousness in the Hadith, and even repeated today as evidence that the Jews are basically dishonest and untrustworthy and enemies of Allah. As the Quran says, as I noted in chapter 5, verse 82, the Quran says they're the worst enemies that the Muslims have. And then in three passages, chapter 2, verse 63 to 65, chapter 5, 59 to 60, chapter 7, 166, the Jews are transformed into apes and pigs for disobeying Allah. And even to this day, you have people, Hamas leaders and others, saying that the Jews, the sons of apes and pigs, have said this or that because they believe the Quran. And so there were three Jewish tribes in Medina when Muhammad moved to Medina. Excuse me, the Banu Qurayza, Banu Kanuka, Banu Nadir. Muhammad exiled two of them, the Kanuka and Nadir, to the oasis of Khaybar in northern Arabia. And then he made an alliance, so to speak, with the third, the Qurayza. There it is, yep. That's chapter 2, 63 to 65. where you have the Bukhari hadith that quotes at the end, "Become monkeys, despised and rejected." That's from chapter 2 of the Quran, 65. You know something else? Do you know Admiral Richard Burton?
No.
Admiral Richard Burton was a 19th century Englishman, and in 1852 he decided to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. But he was an
Okay.
Englishman. He was not a Muslim, although he may have converted. It's a little bit unclear. But he did not want to go to Mecca as a convert because he knew that as a convert, and especially as a convert from the West and from England, he would be treated royally. He would be treated like a king. Richard Burton wanted to go to Mecca as an ordinary Muslim would go to Mecca. And so he wrote a book about this, a wonderful book about his pilgrimage to Mecca. He went to Cairo. He had learned Arabic very, very well. And he went to Cairo. And he knew that even though he had learned Arabic fluently, he would still not sound like a native because he wasn't a native speaker. So he represented himself in Cairo as a Pashtun from Afghanistan. And this is 1852, you see. It was not so easy to travel. Nobody in Cairo had ever met a Pashtun. They didn't know what they sounded like. So that explained away that he had an accent in Arabic. And he said he was a doctor. And so he cured people in Cairo, this Pashtun physician. And ultimately he went to Mecca in the guise of being a Pashtun doctor. Anyway, when he was in Arabia on his way to Mecca, he saw a species of monkey that he had never seen before. And this is an adventurer, a world traveler. He had been all over the world. But there was a kind of monkey in Saudi Arabia he had never before seen. And he asked the Arabians, "What is that? What kind of monkey is that?" And they said, "Oh, those are the Jews."
That's not a
This is a
joke,
true
is it?
story. It's in his, not a joke. It's in his book. This is what happened when he went to Arabia. They take these stories seriously, so they believe that there is a race of monkeys that are the descendants of the Jews that Allah cursed and transformed.
Couple of years ago, I used to do Bible Museum tour for Muslims. Couple of years ago, I took group of Muslims, and few of them brought some of their kids. And in the tour, one of the kid asked me if I can show them monkeys and pigs, Jewish who are monkeys and pigs in the museum. I just looked at, like, child was like 3 or 5 years old. It was like very small child. From early age, the things they teach the children are very dangerous.
Oh yeah, very much so. I remember hearing about an ex-Muslim from Somalia who went to Europe and for the first time encountered Jews, actual living, breathing human beings, and was shocked that they were just ordinary people and thought that they would be somehow some kind of evil gargoyles who did not have ordinary human characteristics, and was quite surprised to see they were just more people.
So you talked about how Quran kind of use very negative language for Jewish people, and you were talking about how Muhammad kind of expelled Jews and then had a fight with Jewish people. What happened after the death of Muhammad? Like, did Muslim community kind of build bridges with Jewish people, or fighting kind of still? You never know. I'm asking this because, like, there are people, there are people seriously like Jewish people defend Islam.
Yeah, they don't know. People don't know the history. It's astonishing the level of ignorance about these aspects of history, but it's not altogether surprising, really, because Islam is Islam is the only religion that is careful to whitewash its image, and there are people who make very skillful efforts and concerted efforts to rewrite history, to whitewash history, so that people don't have an idea of the crimes that Muslims have committed. For example, the Sphinx in Egypt, and it has no nose. And most people in the Western world will tell you, well, that's because Napoleon's troops used the Sphinx for target practice and shot off its nose. That is not true. It was Muslims many, many centuries before Napoleon got to Egypt who destroyed the Sphinx's nose, because if you have a human figure, to take off the nose or the eyes or both destroys the human image. And so it's no longer an idol that has to be warred against, like blowing up the Buddhas in Afghanistan 20 years ago. And so, but they destroyed the Sphinx, not entirely, they destroyed the nose, but then they blame Napoleon so people don't think ill of Islam. It's the same thing. Robert Kaplan has a book, Balkan Ghosts. Robert Kaplan is a very popular, famous traveler and writer, and he wrote this book about the Eastern Europe. And he was going through Eastern Europe. He went to an Orthodox church, and he saw the sacred icons had the eyes gouged out. And he said the local people told him that this was because the Greek Orthodox ladies would come and scrape off the eyes to use in potions. Now, that's absolutely absurd. I am Orthodox Christian myself, and I know no Orthodox Christian anywhere in the world would ever desecrate an icon in order to make a potion or do anything. And potions are not a Christian thing anyway. The idea that the eyes were scraped out by Orthodox could only be believed by somebody who doesn't know anything about Orthodoxy. The people who destroyed the eyes of the icons were Muslims who wanted to destroy the human image. And then they lied and told Kaplan and told other people, no doubt also, that it was the Christians who did it, not the Muslims. So people will think ill of Islam. But anyway, about the Jews, I first wanted to I wanted to finish the point I was making before, that Muhammad exiled the two, and then the third Jewish tribe in Medina, the Qurayza, he accused of plotting against him. Now, even today, Islamic apologists will say, well, yes, he massacred them, but they were plotting against him. And so all's fair, it was war. But, well, they don't mention how he first exiled the other two tribes, so they didn't have any reason to trust him or to think that their position was secure. So maybe they did plot against him. Maybe that was the wise thing to do. But in any case, he caught them and he was victorious. So he beheaded between 600 and 900 people of the Quraysh. Then he went to Khaybar, the oasis where he had exiled the other two tribes, and massacred them. And that is something you still hear to this day. I've heard it myself in New York. Muslims chanting, Khaybar, Khaybar, Ya Yahud, Jaish Muhammad Sayyid, the army of Muhammad will return. The Khaybar is used as a warning to the Jews that there'll be more massacres by the Muslims. And so Muhammad on his deathbed is supposed to have said, throw all the Jews and Christians out of Arabia and leave only Muslims. And certainly there were no Jews in Arabia after that. And whatever the historical value of those traditions, they were expelled from Arabia. Yes.
Just a clarification question. So you are telling me Islamic tradition teaches Muhammad taught to get rid of all Jews and Christians from Arabia. I hear from Muslims they express how much they love Moses. How does it work? Like, if they really love Moses, why they want to get rid of followers of Moses from their own land and then kind of take over their land.
Well, remember, Moses was a Muslim, you know.
Okay, so they like using Moses.
Right. They don't like the real Moses. They have no respect for him. They think that's just a corruption of the real Moses, who is a Muslim, like Abraham. And so when they say they love Moses, that's not really a gesture that Jews should take as meaning that they have goodwill toward them. It's actually a warning to them, to the Jews, because if the Muslims love the real Moses as they see it, the Muslim Moses, not the Moses of the Jewish scriptures, consequently, they think the Moses of the Jewish scriptures is a corruption. Yeah, Musa. So Moses taught Islam, and that's the one they love. In history, throughout history, there have been Muslims persecuting Jews, waging jihad against them, subjugating them. Many times you hear people say the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492 by the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. And they went to the Ottoman Empire because they knew they would be welcomed in the tolerant Islamic land. And to a certain extent, this is true. The Jews had allied with the Muslims against the Christians in Spain, and they were both expelled when the Spanish completed the reconquest. But then in the Ottoman Empire, did the Jews have equal rights and were welcomed as fellow people of the book? Absolutely not. They were relegated to dhimmi status and given all manner of rules and regulations that they had to follow that enforced their being second class and not having equal rights with the Muslims. And there are terrible stories of that kind all through Islamic history. Even as late as the late 19th century, there's a record in Morocco of Jews going to the local Muslim ruler and saying, "Can we please have permission to wear shoes?" Because they couldn't wear shoes, you see, that was only allowed for the Muslims. And they said, we were not allowed to ride horses, and we have to walk all the way across town to the synagogue, and the streets are dirty and full of rocks and everything else, and and we're old and it's painful, and we're injured by the basic travel. Anyway, it was not allowed because the humiliation of the Jews had to be enforced over their having rejected Muhammad as a prophet.
So that goes back to 7th century according to tradition.
Yes, 7th century, and everywhere, in every place where there were Jews and Muslims, without any exception, the Jews were subjugated, denied basic rights, and made to pay the jizya, the tax, and made to submit to the Muslims. There was never a time, never a place, not in Muslim Spain, as it is often assumed, and not anywhere else, that Jews had equal rights with Muslims and were treated as equal citizens. Never happened.
Okay, so do you know under the umbrella of Islamic Dawa gangs, there is this gentleman called Adnan Rashid. Have you heard of him?
Yeah, I have. I think I might have debated him years ago. I think I did.
Okay,
but I don't
he
really
used to
remember.
lie. He still lies quite a lot.
Well, yeah, they all do.
So I've got short clip under a minute clip. He's talking about living how Jewish people and Christian people lived under Islam. Would you be okay if I just share that clip and then get your comments on it?
Of course.
Not forced down people's throats. Islam was not forced down people's throats. Islam was not forced upon people as a faith. This is why there were so many Jewish people living within the Muslim domain for over 1,000 years. This is why the largest Christian churches and populations were in the Muslim lands for hundreds of years. In fact, Syria and Egypt remained predominantly Christian even 5 centuries after Muslims had taken these lands. So if Muslims were into forcing people to accept Islam, if they were in this business, do you think the people of Syria would have remained Christian for that long? Do you think we would have had Coptic Christians to this day in the year 2021 in Egypt? There are Christians in Egypt to this day. Some of the oldest churches in the world that still stand to this day are in the Muslim lands.
So that's like approximately
Well,
a minute. He still lies, correct?
yeah, he's lying. It's clever lie though, because it's true. People weren't forced to accept Islam. That's true. He's right. You can put it down right here. He can take the clip. Adnan Rashid is right, but he's also lying because he's being deliberately misleading. They did not force people to accept Islam. They forced people into dhimmitude. They forced people to become dhimmis. The Egyptians and the Syrians were not forced to accept Islam. The Egyptians and the Syrians were forced into subservience, and they had to submit to all the humiliating and discriminatory regulations. You can't build new churches or repair old ones. You have to have your step off the sidewalk if Muslims are coming. You have to not hold authority over Muslims, so you can only have the most menial jobs in society, all these things. And nobody was forced to accept Islam, but all you had to do to be free of all that was to accept Islam. So nobody was forced to accept Islam, but if you wanted to live with some dignity, if you wanted to live free, if you wanted to live without the fear all the time that you could be killed or plundered and you couldn't do anything, then all you had to do is accept Islam. And so what happened in Egypt? Egypt was 99% Christian when the Arabs invaded. Now it's 10% Christian. Where did all the Christians go? They're still there. They're the Muslims. They converted, but did they convert because Islam is wonderful and compelling? Did they convert because they heard the words of Muhammad and thought, this is the words of God? Of course not. They converted because it was a path to getting a good job. It was a path to living a decent life. It was a path to being able to not live in poverty and squalor and danger all the time. Now, we can say that the people who are still Christians in Egypt are the descendants of those who had the real courage, who stuck it out all these years and lived and endured all that. And they remained, they held to their faith. But the others, it's understandable. I'm not saying that it's right, but it's understandable why they converted, because life was so miserable for them if they didn't. So Adnan Rashid doesn't mention any of that. He only sets up the straw man that nobody was forced to accept Islam and we have all these Jews and Christians. Well, sure, yeah, nobody was forced to accept Islam, but it became the only appealing option, and every other option was made unappealing, so that many people ended up accepting Islam, not because they thought it was true, but because they were tired of living in such difficulty.
Going back to 7th century, according to tradition, when Muhammad was kicking out Jewish tribes or committing genocide towards Jewish people, did Muhammad give them option to turn to Islam, or otherwise they have to live or they will be killed? Did Muhammad propose them such an option?
Massacred the people at Khaybar. He arrived in the evening and he said, let's not attack now. Let's wait till morning. And if we hear the call to prayer, then we won't attack. So he woke up in the morning and he didn't hear the call to prayer, which meant they were not Muslims. And then he said, Allahu Akbar. It will go hard for a people who has been warned, because he felt as if he had already warned them. He had invited them to accept Islam previously when they were in Medina. And so they refused. Now they could lawfully be killed. Sahih Muslim 4294, very important hadith, says, has Muhammad saying, when you meet the unbelievers, first invite them to accept Islam. If they accept it, then welcome them and don't fight them. But if they don't accept it, then ask them to pay the jizya. In other words, to submit. If they refuse that, seek Allah's help and fight them. So he had already asked the people in Khaybar to accept Islam, and they refused. And they were obviously not submitting, so he fought them.
So the magical word they used before they attacked Kaaba, Allah Akbar. Do you think that's why every time when Muslims decide to take someone's life or harm someone, they say Allah Akbar because of that?
Oh, yeah. Not just that, but other occasions as well, also in early Islam, where it was very clear that this was something that was to be said in the context of warfare against unbelievers. Muhammad Atta, the 9/11 hijacker, do you know that he got on the plane, but his luggage was stopped? It's absurd, but this is what happened. His luggage was flagged as a security risk, but he got on the plane.
How
So
come
he
that?
hijacked the plane, but his luggage survived.
But
And in his
security
luggage,
shouldn't allow him to go through.
right, but they did. So his luggage had, in the first place, it had a tuxedo, evening dress that he was going to apparently change into to meet the virgins. And also a note, a letter to himself that he had written on the eve of the attack. And one of the things he says in the note is, be sure when you begin the operation to shout Allahu Akbar, because it strikes terror in the hearts of the unbelievers. And so it's a proclamation in the first place. Allah is greater. Allah is greater than your God. And this is why, in other words, the jihadi is attacking, to show that Allah is greater and he's going to have victory, give me victory over you, and prove thereby the superiority, his superiority over your God, and also make you afraid with this cry, because striking terror in the hearts of the enemies of Allah, of course, is a Quranic command.
Doesn't look very loving religion so far. So you talked about how Quran uses very nasty language towards Jews. You talked about how Muhammad expelled Jews from their land, even committed genocide. You talked about how the life of Jewish people were so uncomfortable, and they lived under the humiliation in the Muslim land. What do you think? What do you think today we can expect from Muslims who lives in Western, their attitude towards Jewish people?
Well, you know something, it's interesting you ask that, because just recently in Anaheim, California, there was an imam, Mustafa Kamel, who preached that he hoped that Allah would soon humiliate and annihilate the Jews. And he quoted the famous hadith about the end times, where Muhammad says the last day will not come until Muslims kill Jews, and Jews hide behind trees, and the trees cry out, "Oh Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him." Now, people sometimes often dismiss that and say, oh, that's just a last days, end times prophecy. Doesn't have anything to do with our day-to-day life. But actually, he says the last day will not come until Muslims kill Jews. So if you're a believing Muslim and you want the last day to come and Jesus, the prophet of Islam, to descend and kill the non-Muslims and conquer and Islamize the world, then you can hasten that day by killing Jews, because the last day will not come until Muslims kill Jews.
Okay, then. So my question was, what should we expect from Muslims who live in the West, regarding how they need to engage with Muslims? And you are telling me today, in 21st century, in California, there are Muslim preachers who are just going back to the Islamic sources and then encouraging people to get rid of Jewish people.
Yes. There was in Britain recently, you probably heard about the fellow, I forget his name now, but he was the head of a Muslim police association, and it was discovered that he had spread anti-Semitic material, and everyone was shocked. And I think, why are you shocked? Why are you so willfully ignorant? If you had any idea what Islam teaches, you would be surprised at the Muslim officials who don't spread anti-Semitic material. Not at the ones who do, but this is what they believe. This is what they go on, and consequently, of course, in the West, they're going to be teaching these things.
So, Muslims who live in West openly acknowledge Islamic teachings, which full of hate and very dangerous to Jewish people. They openly acknowledge that and they teach those things, versus governments are kind of just intentionally ignoring or just pretending like they never heard of it. What about Muslims who live in Muslim land? Do they have the same, are they aware of the same teachings, or they just hate Israel, that's it?
You know, it's very interesting. I think it's very widely known, even among Muslims who are not devout or observant. Hatun, do you know Bosch Fawston, the artist?
Yes.
He drew the Muhammad cartoon that won our Muhammad cartoon contest in 2015.
Yeah.
And he grew up in a Muslim family. He's Albanian Muslim. He's an ex-Muslim now, of course, but he grew up Muslim. But they were not observant. They were not a religious family. And they had a Quran in the house on a big stand, but nobody ever read it. And he had no idea what was in it. And he had no idea what it taught. But he did tell me that, and actually this is in his speech from the Muhammad art exhibit and cartoon contest that we put on. I believe it's still on YouTube, unless they've taken it down. But he says, even though they were not religious, even though they were not interested really in Islam, they identified themselves as Muslims, and everybody he knew, he said, not just his family, but everybody he knew, hated Jews and was cruel to women. It was culturally universal among the Muslims in his area. And I think that's likely to be so in many areas of the world, in Muslim communities, because these things are attitudes that are inculcated over 1400 years, and they become part of the cultural landscape. Even if you are not devout and observant, they're going to get to you.
So
Yes.
Muslims in Muslim countries have the same theology and same type of love towards Jews.
Yeah, there's no different Quran, there's no different Islam in the West A lot of people
Okay.
pretend there is, but there isn't. It's all the same.
Even Erdogan says like there is only one Islam.
Exactly. And that it's insulting to speak about moderate Islam. It's all Islam.
Okay, so I'm Christian. It seems that Islam teaches bad things about Jews. It seems Muhammad didn't like Jews. It seems that Judgment Day wouldn't come until all the Jews in this world is being killed. Should I bothered about Jews, or I'll just like kind of it's not me, therefore it's different people group. I'll just turn blind eye, or I just ignore. What do you think as a Christian I should do about it?
I think as a Christian, we should ally with all the groups that are similarly threatened by jihad. And I've advocated this for years. But there's a lot of hostility and hostility among Christians still toward Jews, a lot of suspicion among Jews toward Christians. I was once on a panel at an event speaking, and a rabbi was speaking along with me, and he said, we're much closer as Jews to the Muslims than to the Christians because of monotheism, and we don't believe in the Trinity. And I was thinking, well, that's true, but there are more aspects to this than that theology. And the Muslims are wanting to convert or subjugate or kill you, and the Christians will live with you in peace. So maybe you should rethink that. But these attitudes are widespread. And then, of course, there are Christians. There's a terrible reemergence of Christian anti-Semitism, which I never saw for decades, and now it's becoming increasingly common. I think
What was sorry? What was
it's
the
all
response?
part of the
What
global
was the
crisis.
response from? What was the response to you from the Jewish gentleman after you said that, like Islam hates you, but Christians can live with you? What was his reaction? Did he just ignore what you said, or?
Yeah, basically, and he emphasized that there were Muslims who were very charitable and kind toward Jews, and that not all were extremists and all that, that we've heard many, many times.
Such a shame, like they don't even know very basic of their history.
Yes. Well, here again, that's the effect of Islamic efforts to whitewash the history. And so you have stories about the persecution of the Jews. You have to read books by Bat Yaor, books by David Littman, and very few people, of course, have done so. Whereas if you go to the standard histories, they'll tell you that Jews lived in peace and harmony with the Muslims in Muslim lands in the Middle Ages. This is false, but nonetheless widespread. And it's a result of the fact that Muslim groups have taken care to make sure that what was in these textbooks and standard histories was favorable to their group. And Jews and Christians have never made any effort of that kind. So what we have now are textbooks and standard histories and such that are quite favorable toward Islam and negative toward Judaism and Christianity.
Thank you for reminding us that. Just another practical question. So you talked about how even in California, Muslims are calling for death of Jews. In Britain, it is the same. What are the practical ways we can help government to do something about it instead of just saying, "Oh, those people have mental issues"?
Well, the governments of the West need to be realistic about what they're dealing with and understand that somebody like Abdullah Qureshi that we started out discussing at the beginning is not mentally ill. He's working from standard Islamic theology. and then calling upon the mosques in England, the mosques in Britain in general, the mosques in the United States, to renounce these teachings as a condition of operating, just as it would not be allowed for hatred of any other group to be preached in any context. So also these aspects of Islam would have to be discarded. But no politicians have the courage to ask that. And of course, there would be ferocious pushback and Muslim groups saying, oh, this is Islamophobic and it's an infringement upon religious freedom and so on. Religious freedom was never understood previous to our own age as being some sort of a license to break other laws. In the United States, polygamy is illegal, and the Mormon Church preached polygamy. And so the United States government told them that Utah, where the Mormons were, could not become a state of the United States unless the Mormon Church outlawed polygamy. And nobody said, hey, that's an infringement of their religious freedom. It was understood that this was in the public interest for the rights of women and so on. And it's the same thing, that if mosques are preaching hatred of Jews and warfare and subjugation of non-Muslims, what's the benefit to the West to allow that in Western mosques? There is no benefit. It's only asking for civil strife and violence. And so you can say to the Muslims in the West, you're perfectly free to read Quran, to pray to Allah, and so on, but not free to preach these aspects of Islam that are in contradiction to the existing laws of the land.
That just like seems very difficult to me for governments to or the authorities to understand and do something about it.
Yes.
But I still have hope. I still have hope. It's just from human perspective, it seems very difficult because they put their mindset that Islam is untouchable, peaceful ideology.
That's right. Yeah, I don't think any of this is going to happen. But I'm saying if we had a sane society, that's what should happen.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just see if there is any question we can take from the chat. And then I'll bring up that question and we can close the evening from there. There was a question on Muhammad's prophethood, which you talked about how he was asked 3 questions and he knew the answers. Therefore, he was identified as a prophet, but the person after identified as a liar stuff. Do you know any text of the Old Testament where Muhammad is prophesied as a prophet, where Jewish people could find him prophesied?
There are several that Islamic apologists point to. One of them is, of course, the prophet that Moses says will come after him in Deuteronomy 18. But that prophet, it says right there that if he says anything false, then he's not a prophet. And Muhammad said many things that were false and even contradicted himself. And so he's not a prophet. There are others as well. I don't remember offhand. Something in Ezekiel, but I don't remember exactly. Do you know the one?
There are a couple of in Isaiah Muslims bring up as well, but I think overall it would be right to say actually Muhammad is prophesied in the Old Testament as a false prophet, which people need to be aware of it. So that's Deuteronomy chapter 18 as well as Deuteronomy chapter 13.
Okay. So how do I explain all the embarrassing stories of Muhammad if he's purely fictional? They were not embarrassing to the people who wrote them. They are only embarrassing to us. And if you do not understand how some of these stories can be not embarrassing, you have to understand the culture of the time. Child marriage was taken for granted in many areas, and nobody thought twice that Aisha was so young. the marriage to the daughter-in-law to Zainab. Notice in chapter 33 of the Quran, in chapter 33, verse 40, after telling the story of Zainab and Zayd and saying that Muhammad should not refuse what Allah wants to give to him, Zainab, then says, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, rather he is the seal of the prophets. That's 33:40. Now, what does that have to do with Zainab and that whole story? It seems like a complete non sequitur, but maybe it isn't. If Muhammad, in Islamic tradition, in the first place, you have to understand all the prophets are related. And you know, Jesus is Moses' nephew and all that. And so all the prophets are from one family. So if all the prophets are from one family and they're all related, if Muhammad had a son, whether adopted or natural, he would be a prophet. So how can Muhammad be the seal of the prophets unless he has no son? And so it was the whole story could have been invented. I'm not saying it was, but it's possible, in order to reinforce that Muhammad had no son, either adopted or natural, and therefore he is the last prophet, the seal of the prophets. That makes perfect sense of the story and explains why it ends with saying that he's the seal of the prophets, which has nothing to do with the other part of the story. And it shows how an embarrassing story would be not embarrassing in the context of what it was designed to do, which was to reinforce that this is the last prophet.
Aisha, without shame, kind of writes lots of negative things about Muhammad, and Islamic tradition is quite okay about it.
Yeah.
Well, tradition is
the things that are in your song at the beginning. Why would anybody make up stories like that? Well, there are various possible reasons. One might be to demonstrate what an extraordinarily strong individual, what a man Muhammad was, and how he had powers beyond that of normal men. And the parts of the story that we find disgusting and revealing, they're not thinking about that. They're thinking about portraying Muhammad's super substantial virility. And that's what the story's for. And then we focus on these things that were actually peripheral to the people in the ancient world. Like, what, he has this on his clothes and she's scraping it off? How could this be? This is not something that any ordinary, any respectable, decent human being would be doing. Yeah, but that wasn't the point of the story for the people who fabricated it. Also, a lot of the hadith were fabricated by people who wanted to do the things that are in the story, like marry children and so on. And so they have Muhammad do it, and then this justifies
it. Thank you very much for unpacking that for us. I think it's just been over an hour, so we will pause here. Hopefully we will have you again on different topics. We've got a couple of things scheduled. There are a couple of more questions are coming, but I think I'll stop here because you expressed that you were tired at the beginning. I can save those questions for you for next time, if that's okay with you.
I apologize. I also actually have another show in a few minutes, so.
Okay, okay. I really appreciate you made yourself available and unpacked this topic for us. So thank you so much. And thank you very much, everyone who joined us in the chat. By God's grace, we will see you on another live stream. Until we see you, may Christ crucified silence you with his love. Good evening.